So, welcome to another Life After Hours where we answer your questions. Oh, some West Australians, you nip off early from work. So we answer your questions. And tonight we are talking everything about getting into your first home. Clearly, one of the biggest challenges for a new generation of Australians, and not just Australians, but most countries around the world. Getting into your first home is a more and more difficult exercise, but one that we help our members with all the time. So tonight I'm joined by Queenie Tan from Invest with Queenie. Queenie is one of our influencer team at Life Sherpa. Queenie is a representative of Life Sherpa. And Queenie, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us where people can find you, and maybe talk to us about your adventures of getting into your first home.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for joining. I'm so excited. I guess a bit about me. So, I'm a finance content creator. I'm licensed and also licensed by Vince. It's really cool the stuff that Life Shepherd does here. So, we wanted to put this on for free because I know buying a home can be so stressful. It's a lot of money. It's a big commitment, and there are so many steps involved. It just seems, I feel like in other areas of finance, they've revolutionized it and it's a lot more user-friendly and digital, but the home buying process, it still feels very manual, very old. So that's why we wanted to go through this webinar to help you just wrap your head around it. I still remember when I bought my first home, it was in 2019, so 4 years ago, and there were just so many things to know, like needing to get solicitors and people to review contracts. It was very stressful. And I still remember some questions because people will just throw things at you, like you know exactly what to do, and they'll say, "Do you want principal and interest or interest only?" And then you have to research what do they mean by this, or what do they mean by this? So
That's why you need a
hopefully,
good mortgage broker.
yes, exactly, and that's why we wanted to do the webinar. So hopefully, go through some of these things and drop us some questions if you have any questions. No such thing as a silly question. Just let us know in the chat. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, that's a good background there, Queenie. So before we get into the questions, I just want to cover off one that's raised a lot of questions in the registrations, and we have 223 people registered for tonight. And that is the First Home Super Saver Scheme. That's a lot of complex words to say. Here's a way you can use your super and get a tax advantage. So get a little bit of a kickstart on your deposit. So let's kick off and talk a little bit about that. So when we talk about financial life and planning for your finances, we look at things in 8 steps, the 8 steps to financial freedom, we call them. If you're starting to think about buying a home, buying a home, you're probably pretty good at the foundation steps 1, 2, and 3. Spend less than you earn, build an emergency stash, and pay off your debts. And tonight we are, of course, talking about step 7: buy and pay off your home. And just want to quickly cover off the First Home Super Saver Scheme. As I said, this is a way that you can make additional contributions to your super and end up with a boost to your deposit. And of course, the deposit is often the hardest thing to get together. So it really is some free money from the government. And it is one of the few ways that you can get some access to your super before you retire. So I've just hit my preservation age, so I can get mine out, but that doesn't really help you get into your home. So this is one way you can do it, and the tax benefits allow you to get in your home faster without affecting your daily budget. So let's just have a look at the maths and how it works. This is actually quite important. So when you earn your salary, your employer is going to pay you, say, $1,526. That could generate $1,000 in your hand after tax if you took it as normal salary. If instead you told your employer, well, don't give me that $1,526, put it in my super fund, and your super fund pays a lower rate of tax, so that will end up as $1,297 in your super fund. And ordinarily that will be locked in. But if you make contributions above what your employer makes, so they have to be extra contributions, in this case, you give up $1,000 of money out of your pocket and you end up with $1,297 in your super fund. And then when you're ready to buy your home, you can take it out. And now let's look at what happens when we withdraw that $1,297. You pay tax on it at your normal rate. In this case, if you earn up to $120,000, you'll pay 34.5% tax. So that's $447. But the government will give you a 30% tax offset, which is $389, which is 30% of $1,297, which leaves you with $1,239. So the $1,000 that you gave up has now turned into $1,239. So that's $239 that's magically appeared due to this tax sleight of hand. And the net effect of that's $239, which, if you use the whole of your allowance, it adds up to $7,831. So that's $7,831 from the government, in effect. So you might ask, what's the catch? And the catch is that there are some limits. You can only do this once, so you can only be a first home buyer once. There is an annual limit of $15,000. So that's effectively 10 times that 1,526 roughly. Your maximum limit for the year is 50,000. So it'll take you 3 and a bit years to get there. And they're tax years. So obviously you could, if you started in June, you could then do one in July. So that's 2. Then you could do one the following July, which is 3, and then take it out. So that's good. And not all super funds participate. So you'll need to talk to your super fund about whether they are playing in the game. And so what should you do about this today? Well, the first thing is to get your super under control. So is it all in one place? Is it in the right fund? Does that fund support the scheme? Your Sherpa, Life Sherpa, can of course help you with that. And then of course, make sure you're buying the right home. I mean, one of the important messages in all of this is whatever benefits there are from the government, the key is to not let the benefit drive your choice of home. This one, obviously, there's not a lot of limitations on what you can buy. You can't buy a mobile home, you can't buy a boat, you can't buy a caravan, but you, as long as it's an actual house or unit, that works fine. But when we look at some of the stamp duty benefits, some of those are dependent on what type of property you buy. There are some bigger benefits for new properties, which has its problems. So just be careful you're not you're allowing the benefits to drive your choice of home. So Queenie, you were trying to point me something.
Yes, we have a question, our first question.
How do I make sure I'm not getting ripped off when there's constant talk of migration and demand? People are overpaying and don't seem to care that it drives up prices. That's really true. But as a general rule, house prices will rise as incomes rise. And this has been true since before Federation, that unless there's a massive oversupply of real estate, which we've never had in Australia, mostly due to planning restrictions, that if there's not an oversupply, then prices will generally, over time, not every day, but over time, rise with incomes and the level of debt that will support. So obviously, as interest rates go up, that ability to pay falls, which should limit price rises. Over history, Australian house prices have risen roughly by inflation plus 1 to 1.5 a year. Sometimes you'll hear people going, property doubles every 10 years or doubles every 7 years. That's not actually true. There are certainly periods when it does. Sometimes it rises by far more than that. But as a general rule, over time, it rises to just beat inflation, which is really in line with incomes. And given that generally the owner-occupier is the marginal buyer, and so they are the ones who set the prices. But how do I make sure I'm not overpaying for a particular property? Valuations are important. There's plenty of information online as to what the comparable properties sell for. So the number one determinant of what a property is worth is really, well, what do the ones that look like this one sell for in the recent past? So wherever you're looking, look at what the sales are over the past 3 to 6 months. Probably not too much point in looking much beyond that, other than for a specific property. But if you're looking at a 2-bedroom unit in St Leonard's, for the sake of argument, you should be looking at what 2-bedroom units are selling for over the last 3 months, and then try and benchmark the one you're looking at against those. Is it newer? Is it older? Is it bigger? Is it cleaner? Is it better fitted out? Has it got a better view? Has it got a better building? And try and adjust it. But the thing that valuers will look at is, what are the comparable sales? And that's what the bank's going to look at when you go to borrow for it. And that's a really good indicator of the price. Now, when you go to auction, people do get carried away, and occasionally things will sell for way more than they're worth. So going into auction well prepared with comparables is the key to it. And that's a really good reason to narrow your choice down to a handful of suburbs, which you can do by looking at general prices in those areas. Once you've got your budget, that'll tell you what suburbs you can look at, and then just specialize in a couple. So what's the next question?
I think there's a really interesting one.
We talked about, while we're on the subject of FHS, the process of withdrawing the FHS money. That's a really good question, and there is a process. The first step is to get a determination from the ATO. So you can log into your MyGov account, navigate to the super section, and click on Get an FHSS determination. So that will tell you how much you can withdraw. The bit I left out in the earlier numbers, just to simplify things, was the earnings on the money while you're in there. You also get to take out an assessed earnings level, so the determination takes those into account. And once you've done that, you can then apply for a withdrawal. And once you withdraw the money, you have a limited time to buy. So the secret is to wait to withdraw it until you're very close to buying. That should be, make sure that you've done your as many contributions as you're going to make. So wait till after you've made the last contribution and that you're now seriously ready to buy, and then get your determination and apply it. If you take it out, you need to take it out or apply for withdrawal before you sign the contract, because the money needs to be applied to the contract. So the order of this is really important. And this is where a really good mortgage broker will help you get these steps right. If you take it out and don't use it for property, you get a year to use it. You can apply for an extension. But if you get to the end of the extension and you haven't used it to buy a property, your choice is now to put it back in again, or to pay a little bit extra tax and keep it out. And what I find is most people choose to keep it out because it was money they were going to use for a property or to spend rather than to provide for retirement. If you've got unused carry forward, yes, so all contributions above your employer contributions can be used for FHSS, and obviously you need to keep within your annual $27,500 what's called a concessional contribution cap. would you get $27,500, and that's the amount that you or someone else can claim a tax deduction. So your employer is handing over $11,000. So, sorry, 11%. So if you're earning $100,000, that's $11,000 that your employer is putting in, which leaves you with $16,500 of additional capacity to contribute. But for FHS purposes, you can only use $15,000 a year, even if you have carry forward limits. So if you put $100,000, if you $100,000 earner, if you put $11,000 in employer contributions the previous year, and you had $16,500 carry forward from the previous year plus this year's $16,500, you're still limited to $15,000 for FHSS purposes. You can put more in, but you won't be able to withdraw it for FHSS purposes. So Gladys says, if you put it back in, can you then withdraw it again? And the answer is no. You get to do one withdrawal in a lifetime. So make sure it's right. So a few traps for young players. The ATO are pretty good. There's some really good resources on the ATO website, but your mortgage broker should really be helping you do that. So what was the question about withdrawing it? Have we covered that one off?
I thought there was one that was quite interesting. Let me just find it. I think somebody asked, do you think they would ever change the scheme and then you'd have your money locked in there? But I think they usually tell you beforehand, like the year before they
everything
make changes.
Is technically possible, but in practice, when they make changes to the tax or super system, they generally do what's called grandfathering existing arrangements. So if you put some money in on the premise that you could take it out, it's extremely unlikely that any government would change the rules and backdate them. They might limit how many further contributions you could make, but I would be gobsmacked if a government went backwards on it. That's not to say it couldn't possibly happen, but I would put that as a very low probability of occurring, close to zero. Casper says, when I take it out, does it affect my tax for the year? Absolutely it does. So when on those numbers that I did, when you take the money out, it gets added to your income for that year. And so you pay tax on it, but you get an offset of 30%. So if you're a 34% taxpayer, which is earning up to 120,000, which covers most people, and in fact, from 2024, it will cover the vast bulk of the population will pay 30%. So it gets added to your income, and you pay tax, right? But you get an offset of 30%. So on a 34% taxpayer, the net effect of that is you pay 4% of it in tax. Where this gets a bit tricky is if it takes you over a tax threshold. So if you earn $100,000 a year, you're a 34.5% taxpayer. If you take out 40, whatever thousand it is, if it just that bumps you up to 140,000 for the year. So that bit over 120 will be taxed at the higher rate, but you still get the 30% tax rebate. So it's always free money. But that is a point worth making. If I've already bought an investment property, can I still use FHS? The answer is no. The test is, have you owned property in Australia? And that includes commercial property. So it's not just a home. Some of the stamp duty limitation, some of the stamp duty discount schemes will allow you to do that, but not for the FHSS. Mike asks, the apartment I want is too small in square meters for the first home, 5% deposit. Yeah, now that's a really good point. When you're looking at property to buy, size matters. And the reason it matters is most banks have a minimum size that they want.
50 square meters.
50 is a really good number. And at 50 square meters, you should be able to use the 5% deposit scheme that Mike refers to is called the First Home Low Deposit Scheme, or FHLDS. And that allows you to avoid lender's mortgage insurance, which I'll come back to in just a moment, and have a deposit as low as 5%. The downside of the scheme is that there are a limited number of banks that offer it, and they generally won't keep their sharpest prices for people using the scheme. So generally you pay a higher rate, but you do save lender's mortgage insurance. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, and if you really are close to the 5%, you don't have much of a deposit and struggling to get to 5%, then it's certainly worth looking at. But it does come with some restrictions, and size is one of them. If you've got a bigger deposit, there are certainly banks that will lend you 40%. Lend you on a 40 square meter unit. But generally, if you want choice of a lender, you need to be looking at a 1-bedroom that's 50 square meters or more. And for those of you in Melbourne, be really careful. In Melbourne, the balcony and the car space is often counted in the square meters that agents advertise. Not so much in Sydney, but in Melbourne, they're often added in. So you need to be really careful as to when the agent tells you this is a 50 square meter unit, you want to be, double check the floor plan or the strata scheme documents, which will be attached to the contract. It's the fat 200-page thing at the back of your contract that nobody ever reads, but you should read it. And usually it will have a strata plan showing you how much is actually on your title. Rima says, can I withdraw the First Home Super Saver amount the same year as the year of contribution? The answer is yes. So, you could start on June 21st of one year and put your 15 in. You could put another 15 in on July the 1st, another 15 July the 1st after that, and 5. I think does that add up? That adds up. And 5 the next one, and then withdraw it the next day. The longer it's in, the more of the earnings you get to take out. But excuse me, they're relatively minor in the scheme of things. But yes, in theory, you can put it in and take it out. It will take possibly 14 days for your super fund to process it. And you need to make sure, and this is a bit of a trap for young players, if you're putting money in from after-tax money, that you're writing a check to your super fund and claiming the tax deduction yourself, you've got to make sure you claim the tax deduction before you take the money out. Otherwise, you lose the deduction. So a bit of a trap for young players. That's why salary sacrifice is so much easier. If your employer does it, do it that way.
Should we go on to the next slides?
Yeah.
What do you think? We'll answer some of your questions as well throughout.
So, so then before we get into buying, it's a really good thing to think about. Why should I buy? Should I rent or should I buy? That's a question that we deal with all the time. And the answer is that it's not a purely mathematical answer. And there are a whole bunch of psychological benefits that home ownership delivers. And it is generally associated with people who do better with money. And the reason that is that it actually forces you to save. That renting in the first year, so typically, we've got interest rates at 6%. Typically, rental yields, that is the ratio of the rent to the value of the property, is usually closer to 3 to 4% and lower in some more prestige suburbs. But typically in Sydney, the average rent on an apartment, so if an apartment is worth $500,000, it will generally rent for $15,000 a year. So in the first year, the rent will almost always be less than the cost of servicing a mortgage on the same property. And of course, you forego the earnings on your deposit. So in the first year, your cash flow is always going to look a lot worse. But with rent, it goes up every year. So over time, so in this graph, you can see that the blue line is the rent rising over time, whereas the orange line is the mortgage payment. Well, mortgage payment plus maintenance and rates and stuff. So there is a period of time where the rent will be less, but over time, you will spend more renting over enough time. And that's the advantage. So it's really a decision to, do I buy, I've got to have accommodation somehow, right? I've got to live somewhere, I need a roof over my head. And my choice really is, do I buy it on the spot market by renting it? Or do I buy it on the fixed price market by buying it? And if you had the discipline to save the difference at the beginning and invest it year in, year out, the difference in over time, especially if you move 2 or 3 times, which most people do, the difference evens out over time. But I have yet in all of my decades doing this to see someone who actually does it reliably. And that's the discipline of buying, as well as all those other benefits. So think about buying your home as a hedge against rising rents rather than an investment. The temptation is to think about your home as an investment because real estate goes up. But the disadvantage of thinking about it as an investment is that it tempts you to buy into the, if some is good, more must be better, because investing more must be better than investing less. But the hidden cost in that is that whilst you may be capturing the capital growth tax-free as it goes, you're actually spending more on accommodation, and therefore there's less money available to do other things. And so less is more. If you want to invest in property, invest in property. If you want to buy a home, and don't try and confuse the two. So that's the big challenge in buying homes. So the key to it is, buy real estate, not too much, when the time is right for you. And to work out what not too much looks like, and this is sort of the fallacy behind rentvesting. And there are two really good articles on the Life Shopper website. We'll put the links in the chat. We've got one called Should I Rent or Buy, which goes through the analysis and shows what the relative cash flows and asset position looks like over very long periods of time. And the second one is rentvesting, which is the concept of renting where you live and buying somewhere else. And one of the biggest problems with rentvesting, which is usually pitched as a way to buy where you can afford and live where you want. But the fallacy behind that, or the marketing lie behind that, is that what that does, if we can go back to the monthly cash flow graph over time, by looking at renting what I can afford, effectively that means moving the blue line up to start where the orange line is. So you end up spending more over time and you forego the tax benefits on your property. So, and it also confuses two decisions. The two decisions it confuses are, should I rent or buy? And if I rent, where should I invest my money? Whether that be shares or property or whatever. And by confusing those two questions, you actually end up with a very muddled answer. So I think those two articles, I think, will make good reading for any potential first home buyer. Gladys, so just moving back to the First Home Super Saver Scheme for a moment, Gladys asks, is there a limit on how old contributions can be counted towards the First Home Super Saver? And so what Gladys is getting at there is, earlier we talked about that if you don't use the whole of your 27,500 allowance in any 1 year, you can carry forward to future years for up to 5 years. And I think this year is the first year it's a full 5 years. But you're still limited to the $15,000 in a year. So in theory, you could go use right back to 5 years. There is no time limit, but usually you'll get hit by the $15,000 cap first. So that's the question of that.
I think the next question has a good question from Brian. It will answer that one.
Yeah.
Because I think this is interesting, like offset accounts and managing the home loan rising interest rates. I think that kind of ties in perfectly.
So have you got an offset account, Queenie?
I actually don't, because I'm on a fixed interest rate and my fixed interest rate's really good. And a lot of fixed mortgages don't have offset accounts, unfortunately. But if I had a variable rate or like a partially variable rate, I would definitely be using it.
Cool.
It's really good.
Well, let's just fill in that background for people. So an offset account is a deposit account. So it's like a normal bank account, except instead of paying interest, you agree with the bank that they deduct the balance you keep in this account from your home loan balance, so they only charge you interest on the net difference. And so that effectively means that you are earning money on your, earning interest on your money in your offset account at the home loan rate. So if you want to park money short term, offset accounts can be a really attractive place to do that.
And like Brian says, tax-free, because you're saving interest, so that tax office doesn't look as a saving as income, if that makes sense, because you're saving interest. But if you're making that in like a high interest savings account, that would be classified as income.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of traps for young players though, Brian. The first one is loans with an offset facility generally come with either a higher interest rate compared to a basic no-frills home loan, and many of them have monthly fees. So you generally need to have a reasonably large balance relative to your mortgage balance to make them cost effective. So if you've got if you're early in your home buying career, you've got a big loan and only small amounts of money saved, you're probably better off buying a no-frills home loan without an offset and paying the tax on the interest you earn in your deposit while it's sitting there. But if you've got reasonable sums of money, it can certainly be very attractive. So that's that one.
We might have one from Matt. He says, is the idea of saving up a larger deposit to make mortgage payments more manageable an outdated idea?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. That historically, people have got an obsession about having a 20% deposit, which means if you're buying a $500,000 unit, you need a $100,000 deposit to get to a 20% deposit and avoid paying what's called lender's mortgage insurance. Now, lender's mortgage insurance is not technically insurance. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's really a risk fee. So generally, because we don't have, most banks don't have different prices based on the proportion of your property you're borrowing, or loan to value ratio. They will generally charge you this fee if you borrow more than 80%. And it starts off as a relatively small number. So at 82%, it's a very small number. And it rises as a percentage of the loan as you borrow more and more of the purchase price of the property. At 95%, which is about as good as you can get without being part of some of these schemes, you're probably going to pay 3 to 4% of the loan borrowing as a lender's mortgage insurance fee. So if you're buying a $500,000 unit and you're borrowing $475,000, 3% of that is $12,000 something, and so that's a big chunk. So the bigger deposit, the lower your LMI. There's a bit of a sweet spot at around 88% borrowing, where the LMI percentage drops quite quickly once you get below 88% borrowing. And the trade-off you've got to make is, are property prices rising while you're saving the extra bit? So if it takes you 6 months longer to save the extra 10% deposit, and property prices are rising at 10% a year, well, you're going to end up paying more than you would have paid in lender's mortgage insurance. So there is a trade-off there. But of course, as you say, Matt, the fact that you can borrow a bigger percentage shouldn't be used as an excuse to buy a bigger house. That's the trick. So the how much house can I buy argument is really a function of what's my income and what are my other expenses, and that determines how much I can borrow. And obviously, as interest rates rise, that number is falling. So every time the Reserve Bank puts up the interest rate by 0.25%, your ability to borrow drops. So that's your borrowing power. Now, whether you should borrow all you can borrow is a bigger question, and the banks generally lend you more money than is comfortable to repay. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. So having worked out how much you can borrow, then you can add your deposit, and that tells you how much in total you can spend. Then you need to deduct your stamp duty, and for those of you in New South Wales, stamp duty has now been exempt for up to $1 million, I think, with the new rules, or 800,000.
I think 800,000.
It's 800 complete exemption and a partial exemption up to $1 million. So that actually covers off most of the properties that first home buyers are buying, even in Sydney. And so that allows you to use your deposit to pay for an actual deposit, not for stamp duty.
I guess that goes into the next question, first home guarantee, which we've got like a little chart.
So that's the next scheme that's really, really important, because it's not dependent on the type of property that you buy. So this is a scheme where the government, the federal government that is, effectively pays your lender's mortgage insurance for you. In fact, it's a government guarantee, but it saves you lender's mortgage insurance. And in that case, you can borrow up to 95% of the property price, or 98% for single parents, and some domestic violence survivors. There's a few more obscure exemptions, but generally it's for people who have a small deposit and are first home buyers and are buying within a price range. It does vary from state to state, so check it out. And their income is below a threshold. Now, the income test is an interesting, particularly at this time of year, because it's based on your last year's taxable income, which means you have to have done your tax return. So those of you who are looking to buy and think you can wait till October 31st before lodging your tax return, this might be a good idea to do it more quickly. So you need to get your tax return. It is based on pure taxable income, so none of those add-backs for FBT or negative gearing, none of those add-backs happen, so it's just what it says on your tax return. If that's below the threshold, which I think is $125,000 from if for singles. Is that right?
I don't have the caps
I
there.
thought it was it, but
yeah.
once you're under that and you're a first home buyer and you're a citizen, I think, and you're buying below the threshold, you qualify for this. The next trick is to get an allocation from one of the banks, and this is where things often go astray. It's a bit of a lottery, so you need to be ready to go. The banks generally won't give you an allocation until you've got a property in mind, because obviously you need to know what property you're buying to know whether you qualify, and they don't want to hand out their allocations to someone who might not buy this year. So there's a bit of a rush at this time of year. So if you wait till January or February, the odds of you getting an allocation are pretty slim. There are a few categories of allocations. There's ones for existing properties, which tend to go quickest. There are ones for new properties, which tend to hang around a bit more. And then the ones for the special categories or the regional categories tend to have a little less competition for them. But as I mentioned earlier, the downside of using the scheme is that you may pay a higher interest rate and there's less competition from banks. So I have seen cases where somebody with a deposit, they actually had about 6% deposit and they were debating whether to do it or not, and it actually worked out better for them to not take it. With the guarantee, it has to be a home, so you've got to move into it. You can't rent it out, and you can't really refinance your home loan until you've got below the 80% loan to value ratio. So it comes with a lot of restrictions, but it can work well for some people.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions. Oh, a few people have asked. Kath asked, will the webinar be recorded? It will.
Yes, we are recording the webinar. You will get an email in the next day or two with a link to watch it again.
And the slides as well?
I don't see why not. We hadn't thought about that one, but I'm sure Paolo will work out how we do that. So I'm going to stitch Paolo up and answer yes to that question.
Yeah. Oh, how exciting. Oh, I think we've got a good question from Josh. So what are your thoughts on buying an apartment versus a townhouse/house? I've heard people saying having land is better for capital growth. Would it be better to stretch on finances a little bit to get a townhouse over an apartment?
Now, Josh, that's a really interesting question. And this is one where there's a lot of misinformation around. Most property vendors, or not so much vendors, but property brokers and people writing in the press who have a big interest in selling you a house and land package will run the argument that buildings depreciate, land appreciates. I'm sure you've heard that expression. And that the bigger the land component of what you're buying, in general, the better. Now, land component in that case is not square meters of land, and this is where the misinformation starts to play. It's actually the value of the land that matters. So if you buy a house and land package in the new estates, you might pay
700.
Yeah,
I don't know.
maybe
Some
300,000
places,
for the block and 500 to build a house or whatever. But generally, although there might be 400 square meters of dirt, it's actually a relatively small part of the value of the home. Whereas if you were buying in closer to the city, a 2-bedroom apartment, let's say a 2-bedroom apartment might be worth, I don't know, pick a number, $600,000-700,000. More than half of that is the value of the plot that it sits on. You might not own the dirt individually, but it's in the strata scheme and it's in the value of your property. So it's actually the dollars that matter in terms of land component. And often Smaller homes in the middle ring suburbs often have the biggest land component. So avoid being convinced that that's why you should buy a house and land package in the outer suburbs. The other thing to look at is people will say that houses increase at a faster rate than apartments. And it's true that when you look at median price growth, the median price for houses does rise at a faster rate overall than apartments. But that hides a few things. First of all, it hides the amount of money spent on renovations. Australians spend about 1% of the total value of all houses every year on renovations. And that's baked into those medians. And most of that money gets spent on houses, not on apartments. So the growth rate of house prices includes a component of that value increase from renovations. So when you strip that out and you strip out the high-rise investment stock in the CBDs, which is generally sold to overseas buyers because, let me come back to that in a moment. So they generally underperform, but looked at a quality apartment in a small to medium-sized development outside the really high-rise stuff, there's not a lot of evidence that it performs worse. So the question you ask is, well, is that a reason to buy one over the other? I think it's largely a lifestyle decision. If you can afford a house in a middle ring suburb, then absolutely. If the choice is between a quality apartment in a okay suburb against a house in need of a lot of repair in a not so good suburb, I think I take the apartment other than for lifestyle reasons. So it's pretty hard to make broad generalizations, but don't be swayed by the media on this one. When it comes to your home, it's as much an emotional decision, and it comes down to buy real estate, not too much, when the time is right. So what was the question you wanted me to come back to?
Exciting.
Matt asks, for the purpose of the first time guarantee incomes, would income put into the FHS count as assessable income? I assume you're talking about the money that is coming out. The contribution doesn't. So the contribution into super reduces your assessable income and so potentially gets you under the threshold for the first home guarantee or the first home low deposit scheme. So that's a positive. And when it comes out, it will get counted in your income. But given that the first home guarantee income limit is assessed on the last year's income, it's not really relevant. So it does make sense, therefore, to make sure that you don't take the money out late in a year and then try and buy in the next year. So it would be a really bad thing to take the money out in May and then try to use the first home guarantee scheme in July or August. So delaying your FHSS withdrawal as late as possible, so that it just comes into a different year.
Very nice. I love all the questions. This is really cool. Up to how much can I borrow?
Now that's a real it depends question, but broadly banks look at your income, your family circumstances, and your other debts in order to determine how much they will lend you. And then they will look at your deposit and the value of the property in order to work out that in respect of this particular property, will they lend you up to that limit? So the serviceability determines the maximum amount you can borrow, and then your deposit and the value of the property determine how much you get for that specific property. So looking at serviceability, generally start with your income, and not all income is created equal. The best income is regular salary without overtime or special allowances or shift allowances or tool allowances or car allowances. So raw salary or wages is the best, and banks will lend most against that. With shift allowances and tool allowances and overtime, different banks treat that differently. So if you're a nurse or a first responder, where or you're do FIFO, fly in, fly out in the mines, you need to be very careful about which bank you choose to maximise your borrowing capacity. So that's the first one, is income. Income from second jobs or casual jobs, not looked at as well. Some banks will haircut it. They might take 80% of it or 70% of it. Varies very much from bank to bank. And second jobs aren't looked as good. Casuals not as good. Being on probation can be a problem. So don't move jobs before you go buy a house. Foreign income's generally problematic. Money from your side hustle may be difficult to get banks to count. If you're relying on anything that's not salary, you'll probably want to need 1 or 2 years tax returns. So income's the starting point. The next point is, well, what other debts have you got? And so if you've got a car loan or a credit card or a personal loan, the payments on that get deducted. And HEX is an interesting one. So most young people these days have HEX or help debt. What matters in terms of serviceability is how much is deducted from your pay, not the value of the balance. So how much you owe doesn't actually affect your serviceability tests. But the payment comes off your pay, so reduces your borrowing. And then they look at your cost of living. So credit cards, before I move on. Credit cards, it's the limit that matters, not how much you actually spend on it or how much of it you pay off. They don't care how much you owe on it. They look at the limit. And a credit card limit can really cut your borrowing capacity. And so getting rid of unwanted credit cards is a good thing. The next thing to look at is your living expenses. And generally, that's dependent on your family income, family circumstance, number of dependents. And there is a minimum level that banks will use. So no matter how frugal you are, they will assume that you spend at least what's called the HEM, the household expenditure measure, which is a sort of an average spend for households of that particular type, where you've got 1 kid, 2 kids, 1 adult, 2 adults. We find that most people are actually a bit more frugal than that, and so that's the threshold. So that's what matters. There are some expenses that come outside the HEM, which will get added on. The bizarre one that I've yet to get anyone to give me a satisfactory answer, but strata levies on the apartment that you're buying are added on. So all other things being equal, they lend you more money against a house than an apartment. Bizarre, but that's the fact. And then other things like some insurances, so your life insurance, income protection insurance, that will get added onto the HEM, which is a great reason why you should consider paying for those out of your super fund. So if you've got life insurance or income protection insurance, consider using your super to pay for it. Health insurance is often counted in additional. So that gets you to income minus debts, or minus debt service, minus living expenses equals available cash. And then they work out how much of a loan that cash would service at the current rate, generally plus a buffer of about 3%. So what all that means is that as interest rates go up and income doesn't go up, your ability to borrow falls. So you need to be careful about, looking at it today and saying, I can borrow $500,000, and then two or three interest rate increases happen before you're ready to buy, and now your pre-approval is not really worth the paper it's printed on. And that brings me to the topic of HEX. Now, generally, we would generally advise people not to pay off their HEX unless they have nothing better to do with the money. The way serviceability is working these days, if you could pay off your HEX in one go, so if you're, we were working with a woman who wanted to buy a unit on the surf coast of outside Melbourne, and she had a reasonably good sized deposit. So she was trying to buy in the 600s. She had a $120,000 deposit, and but because she was limited in her borrowing capacity, her $120,000 deposit plus what she could borrow didn't quite get her there. But by paying off her $20,000 HEX, her borrowing capacity rose by $50,000. And so although her deposit went down and therefore she had to pay a little bit of lender's mortgage insurance, the net difference allowed her to borrow what she needed. But it only works if you've got enough to do it in one go. Paying off half your HEX doesn't change the analysis very much. So they're the main things that determine your borrowing capacity. It's about income, debts, expenses, and deposit. And sometimes a bigger deposit is more valuable. Certainly when interest rates were lower, most people we found were limited by their deposit. As interest rates have gone up, we're now seeing more people limited by serviceability. So it's very much a personal circumstance, and it will depend on what are the debts you've got, how many kids you've got, how you make your living. And so for a borrower who's borrowing a small percentage, like well under 80%, they're PAYG, they've got really good credit score, and they're buying a big house in the city, you can buy a home loan on price. Low rate wins. But if you've got anything quirky in your income or in your family circumstance or in the property you're buying, now banks' policy matters much more than price. It's only a good price if you can actually borrow what you want when you want it. So a really good mortgage broker will be able to help you work through that.
Oh, I also wanted to ask everyone in the chat, what stage are you at the home buying process? Let us know. I think we have a poll that we can put up. Yeah, this will be really interesting to see where everyone's at. So excited.
Yeah, so while people are asking this question, there is another question there about fixed or variable mortgage interest rates. And this again is not a mathematical answer, and you shouldn't be treating this as, can I beat the bank? Do I know more about interest rates than the bank does? And you shouldn't be doing this as a bet on interest rates. I've gone back and looked over 30 years and compared the fixed rate with what would have been the variable rate over the 3 years following that. And on about half the time you'd be right and half the time you'd be wrong. And when you're wrong, you're usually worse wrong than being right. So don't do it for a bet purposes. This is not the TAB. The real way to choose between fixed or variable is how much do I value certainty against price? So do I value the fact that my home loan rate isn't going to change for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years against the potentially lower rate? At the moment, fixed rates are slightly above the variable rate, so you pay a little bit more in the first year. But you may or may not be paying more after a may or may not interest rate that may or may not happen. One interesting thing is there's a couple of lenders now. If you take a long-term fixed rate, like there's a few banks with a 5-year fixed rate, which is only marginally above the variable rate. But if you take the 5-year fixed rate, they don't use that 3% buffer on the serviceability calculation. So it'll actually allow you to borrow more. So if you're a bit tight on your serviceability, that can be a really good option. The downside, of course, is because there's only a couple of banks doing it, your ability to refinance at the end of your 5-year fixed rate is a bit more difficult. So that's the trick, but don't treat it as a bet against the bank. This is a question of, do I value certainty over potentially cost saving? 3 years ago, during COVID, fixed rates were way below variable rates. So almost all of the stuff that we were doing with our members, we were doing 2-3 year fixed rates at 1.8, 1.9, 2%. They're all starting to roll off now. But back then, the fixed rates were generally below the variable rate. So you could get a 1-year fixed rate well below the variable rate, which was sort of a no-brainer. The decision to go to 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, that was a bit more of a difficult question to answer. But you were still saving money in the short term. And in hindsight, you've ended up saving a lot of money. But hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it is.
So now we're sort of getting to the end of time, but so getting started, the key thing in all of this is know yourself, how much you can afford. And if you remember the graph I put up about rents being lower than purchase price, the key thing is if you're thinking about borrowing, try putting away the difference between your rent and what the mortgage would be and seeing how you feel living on it. I call that the try before you buy approach. That A, it's a great way to save, but B, it's also a way of testing, do I actually feel comfortable living on what's left after I pay for this mortgage? And if you save the difference between the rent on the property that you'd like to buy and the cost of serving the loan on that property, that amounts to quite a bit of money, and that difference can be the key to doing it comfortably. So try before you buy.
I like it. Oh, maybe I could have like a bit of a tip because this is what worked for us.
Well, you've done it more recently than I have, Queenie.
Yeah, so I think something that worked for us was we bought a place that was in an older building, like an apartment in an older building. It did not look nice at all in the photos. It looked, it was really like the oven was broken, the cupboards were falling off the hinges, but we fully renovated it. And it's good because we bought it for a discount, obviously, because it needed the renovations. We made the renovations, but now the property's worth a lot more than obviously what we paid for it and what the mortgage was. So I think sometimes as well, like especially what Vince was saying with apartments, there could be some like hidden gems, especially like in the older apartments. And as we know, some of the newer apartments, some of them might have like defects in some of the buildings and you are paying a premium. So maybe have a look at some of the potentially like older blocks or the more boutique kind of blocks with only a couple of units, and you might be able to find somewhere with good value. Or what are your thoughts about old apartments versus new?
I'm a big fan of older apartments. They tend to be better built. They tend to have better sound insulation. They tend to cost less to maintain. And there was a huge trend to build what in New South Wales are called 6-packs. So these were a lot of it around the inner west and the lower North Shore, where there's blocks of 6 units, generally red brick, 3-story walk-ups, 2 units on each floor, and they can make really good buying. And they're cheap to maintain because they don't have much common area. They don't have lifts, they don't have gyms, they don't have pools, they don't have doormen, and they're small enough for owners to know each other. So they can often be very good value. They tend to, some of them look a bit ugly from the outside, but they can be great value. Think about parking. How valuable is parking to you? Depending on where it is. If you're going to buy in Darlinghurst, Surrey Hills, parking is less of a big deal. Buying in Balmain, Rozelle, Lilyfield, Annandale without parking is probably not a good idea. But you want to buy in the some of those older blocks on the northern beaches, Fairlight, Manly, Harbord. There's a lot of really older units there without parking that can be good value. But the important point is to not buy too much and to make sure that you're going to be comfortable living in it for a long time. The cost of moving house could be 10% of the price of your house by the time you pay for agents' fees, a little bit of marketing, some moving costs and stamp duty on the new place. So it's not something you want to do very often. So when I talk about buying property not too much when the time is right for you, when the time is right for you is really important because, if your circumstances are going to change in the next few years, you're going to have a family, or your family's going to move out, are you going to become an empty nester, are you going to find a partner and want to move in together? So buying a one-bedroom unit and then finding in 2 years' time you've got a partner and you're about to have a baby, that can be a very expensive exercise. So be sure you know where you want to live. It's probably good to live in a few areas of the city before settling and to not to rush into it. So I think that's probably as much as we have time for. As I said, we will send you an email with a link to the recording. So for those of you who registered and didn't turn up, you're obviously not hearing this, but they will get it as well. Paolo will work out how to put the slides in the email. They're in the file section, which you should be able to click on and access on your browser. And if you'd like to talk to a mortgage broker, we'll put a link into the Life Sherpa so you can book a call with one of our team to get a sense about where you want to do. So there's a link directly to the diary. And listen, we've had a blast being here, Queenie and I. There's just so many great questions. We're going to have to come back and do this again. And certainly the question about what should I be buying is one that we really haven't covered too much. And but really the first step is working out what's your budget, which will tell you where you can buy. And then try and focus on an area. Don't try and cover the whole city. Get it down to a few suburbs, and you don't have to give up too many Saturdays to go looking. You could also consider a buyer's agent, which I guess we can cover off in another session. So listen, guys, thank you so much for taking time out on a cold Thursday to talk about the often stressful topic of buying a home. We're here for you on the journey, and look forward to seeing you the next time.
Yeah, excited. Thank you so much. Oh, and note, mortgage brokers are actually free because the bank pays them a commission. So as a first-time buyer, as a property buyer, you don't actually pay for the services, which is really cool. Something I didn't know when I was buying my first home. So yeah, we've put a link in the chat, so if you want to check it out.
And if you're a Life Sherpa member, you might actually get some of that commission back in your pocket. So best of luck in your journey. We'd like to be there for you, and have a good one.
Thank you. See you.
Thank
Bye.
you.